Today I want to talk about a fundamental unit of human brain function. It's probably not something you've already heard of. It's definitely not something you're going to hear physicists or philosophers talk about, because this has to do with how the brain actually works. Yeah, you're going to hear me get snarky a lot about philosophers and physicists and what they claim about the mind and brain. There are many different levels of functional organization in the brain to understand. You can talk about single neurons, you can talk about cell assemblies and circuits, which are small groups of neurons. You can talk about networks, which are larger groups of neurons. You can talk about systems, you can talk about lobes, you can talk about cerebral hemispheres. And these are all very different and important levels of organization that you have to understand if you want to learn how brains work. But if you can learn about this relatively simple elementary component that I'm going to cover today, you'll begin to understand what the real biology of the mind is all about. In my opinion, any accurate understanding of the brain and cognition needs to be anchored in this critical concept. If you can understand this, you're going to have an intuitive conceptualization that will help address a whole bunch of other questions you have about how brains work. And you'll be inoculated against all sorts of confusion and neuromyths that people who don't first learn these concepts are vulnerable to. So let's have some 3-pound thoughts, shall we? The unit of human brain function I want to talk about today is called the cortical area. When neuroscientists use the term area, we're not using the word in the sense of meaning a vague location or something like that, right? We're referring to a unit that has a very specific and detailed definition. To learn what a cortical area is, let's look at the brain. So this is the cerebral cortex, this area on the outside. Now looking at this cerebral cortex model and also looking at a real brain, you can't see them, but the whole cortex is made up of sort of a patchwork of smaller functional areas. On this model and on real brains, the boundaries of these little areas are invisible to the naked eye. So the cerebral cortex is a complex functional mosaic. It's made up of little subdivisions, little chunks that all do different functions and computations. Now, some of these are about the size of maybe your thumbnail. I think that's a common size. Some of them are a bit bigger and some can be smaller. There are 4 defining features of a functional area. The first defining feature of a functional area is function or computations or processing operations. So the concept of this first defining feature is basically just the idea that that patch of cortex or that snippet performs functions that are somewhat different than the other cortical areas. The second defining feature of a functional area is essentially architecture. This is just a reference to the fact that different functional areas have different types of neurons in them. There are different sizes and shapes and distributions, depending on the functional area. The third defining feature of a cortical area is connections or connectivity. Every cortical area has its own profile of information that it receives and what locations in the brain it receives it from, and information that it sends to other locations and how many locations it's connected to and what the strengths of those connections are. The fourth defining feature of a cortical area is its topography or its maps. Different cortical areas are often organized according to spatial layouts. So for example, there are visual areas, a whole bunch of them actually, that are organized according to your visual field, spatially. In somatosensory cortex and in motor cortex, there are maps that are organized according to the spatial layout of your body. So to review, the 4 defining features of a cortical area are its function, its architecture, its connections, and its topography. You might have noticed this. The easiest way to remember the 4 defining features of a cortical area are the acronym FACT. F-A-C-T, function, architecture, connections, and topography. So even though you can't see these divisions either on this model or on a real brain with your naked eye, cortical areas exist, and they're basically different patches across the entire cortical surface that are devoted to different kinds of processing operations that support cognition. So in learning what a cortical area is and how it's central to the functioning of the cerebral cortex, what do you now know? How do you think about the mind-brain relationship? What are the implications? What are some of the take-homes here? Well, I would say one of the first things is that you should now be able to see how cognition maps onto brain function. If you take a large psychological construct, something like attention or memory, let's say language. So let's say I ask you to perform speech production, right? I show you a picture and I say, name this thing. Well, you can begin to see how a cognitive task like that requires the combined action of widespread brain regions, and each of these cortical areas is contributing a different set of processing operations to the successful completion of that larger task. So, like one neuron can't do language, right? And 5 neurons can't do language. And one cortical area can't do language. Language is done by a whole bunch of brain regions and cortical areas working together, right? Millions of neurons, large populations of neurons. So each cortical area is contributing a specific set of connections and processing operations to the performance of any cognitive task. So I also want to point out that cortical areas are functionally defined, right? So we can point to a particular gyrus on a brain and say, there's the superior temporal gyrus. But to actually identify functional areas, they have to be mapped functionally and physiologically. They're also part of the brain's plasticity. So you can have functional areas form up and specialize at different times of your life and even go away depending on what the brain has been spending time doing. So for example, when you're a child and you learn to read and then you subsequently spend a whole bunch of time feeding letter strings to your visual cortex, you'll develop a new functional area called visual word form area. And it's something you didn't have when you were a baby. Your fusiform gyrus was always sitting there in your brain from birth, but you made part of it become specialized for the automatic and fast processing of visual word forms when you gave it all that experience. And lastly, this gives you an idea of how some of our brains might be kind of idiosyncratic. Although there's a lot of regularity across people in the general location of a lot of cortical areas, we do differ from one another in subtle ways and for certain tasks in not so subtle ways with regard to the cortical areas we've developed. The specific boundaries of cortical areas and even the existence or non-existence of certain cortical areas differ across people based on the idiosyncrasies of our personal experience and also on our genetics. So I hope you've learned the basic concept of what a cortical area is. I genuinely think this is really fundamental for learning about the biological basis of the mind and about human brain function. Let me know in the comments if anything is still unclear or if you have any questions about this at all. Thanks for watching.